Emily Klein leaned over her desk in the bustling newsroom of the Capitol Chronicle, her fingers tapping rhythmically on her keyboard. The city's mayoral election was just weeks away, and with it, the usual flurry of campaign slogans, press conferences, and promises that often hid the truth. Emily, a rookie investigative journalist, had one goal: to peel back the layers of this polished election and uncover what lay beneath. It was late in the evening when her phone buzzed. Emily glanced at the screen, a blocked number. Curious, she answered. "This is Emily. Do you want to know the truth behind the election?" A low, distorted voice murmured on the other end. Emily's pulse quickened. "Who is this?" "No names, just follow the trail," the voice replied. There was a brief silence, then a single word: Vanguard. Then the line went dead. Emily leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. Vanguard? It was a name she had only heard in rumors. Whispers about a shadowy organization that supposedly influenced local politics from behind closed doors. But no one had ever confirmed its existence, and most thought it was nothing more than a conspiracy theory. Excitement mixed with apprehension as she typed Vanguard into her notes, her mind already racing with possibilities. If there was even a hint of truth to this, it could be the story of a lifetime. The next morning, Emily began her investigation. She spent hours scrolling through old news articles, city council records, and obscure forums. What she found was fragmented but unsettling. A few unexplained resignations, mysterious donations, and a handful of unsolved cases tied to former city officials. It was as if there were pieces of a puzzle scattered across the city, waiting for someone to fit them together. Later that day, she arranged an interview with a local political analyst, Martin Burke, who was known for his outspoken opinions about the city's corrupt elite. They met at a quiet coffee shop downtown. Martin, a wiry man with sharp eyes, leaned forward as he spoke, his voice low and serious. "Vanguard, you're chasing shadows, Emily. If they exist, and I'm not saying they do, getting close to them would be dangerous. You're not the first journalist to dig into this, but none of them ever found anything concrete." Emily took notes, undeterred. "But do you think there's any truth to it?" Martin hesitated, glancing around before answering. "Some of us believe they have the power to influence elections, but they cover their tracks well. If you push too hard, you might find yourself discouraged." As they continued talking, Emily noticed a man in a dark jacket sitting at the counter, his gaze fixed on them. The man's face was hidden under a baseball cap, but his attention was unmistakable. Trying to ignore her rising unease, she wrapped up the interview and headed for the door. Just as she stepped outside, she felt a sudden shove. She stumbled forward, barely catching herself before hitting the ground. When she turned around, she saw the man from the coffee shop vanishing into the crowd, leaving her shaken but unharmed. Her heart raced as she realized this wasn't a random encounter. Someone had been watching her. Someone wanted to warn her, or worse. That evening, back at her apartment, Emily locked her door, checked her windows, and sat down at her laptop. The events of the day had shaken her, but they had only strengthened her resolve. She knew she was onto something big, something dangerous. Emily's investigation was gaining momentum, but she knew she couldn't do it alone. The incident with the stranger had left her shaken, and she was sure she'd need help to dive deeper without putting herself at risk. That's when she thought of Rick Howard. Rick was an old friend, someone she'd known since college. Though they had chosen different career paths, they had kept in touch. Rick was now a political consultant, currently working with the campaign team of Charles Whitaker, one of the top candidates for mayor. Emily reached out, and they arranged to meet at a small bar downtown. As she sipped her drink, she noticed Rick walking in. He looked tired, his suit slightly rumpled, and a look of mild concern crossed his face when he saw her. "Emily," he greeted, sitting down across from her. "You're still as fearless as ever, but Vanguard, that's not a safe topic." Emily leaned forward, lowering her voice. "That's exactly why I need help, Rick. You know the people involved in this campaign. Maybe you've heard something, anything, that could help me understand if Vanguard is real or just a myth." Rick hesitated, glancing around. "I can't say I've seen anything firsthand, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There are whispers, strange things happening behind the scenes, unexplained donations, anonymous calls giving campaign tips. Some of us are starting to wonder if the election is even fair." Before Rick could say more, a shadow fell over their table. Emily looked up to see a tall, broad-shouldered man in a leather jacket. He introduced himself with a straightforward nod. "Detective Jack Black," he said, flashing his badge briefly. "Heard you were asking about Vanguard." Emily's eyes widened. "You're the detective working on the recent corruption cases?" Jack nodded. "Not officially, though. My boss doesn't want us poking around, says it's out of our jurisdiction. But there are people, good people, who've been pushed out of their jobs or worse. Vanguard doesn't just scare reporters, it keeps the entire police department in line." Rick looked skeptical, his eyes narrowing. "If Vanguard's really this powerful, why risk your career to investigate them?" Jack shrugged, his face hardening. "Sometimes justice means breaking the rules, and I can't do it alone." Emily glanced between Rick and Jack. It was risky, but she could see that their interests aligned. Each of them had a different piece of the puzzle. She had the media's reach, Jack had law enforcement's resources, and Rick had access to the inner workings of the political machine. Reluctantly, they agreed to form a fragile alliance. Over the next few days, Emily, Rick, and Jack began pooling their resources. Emily shared her research on Vanguard's history. Jack brought in confidential police files he'd borrowed from the evidence room, and Rick provided information on recent donations and untraceable funds flowing into Whitaker's campaign. The pieces were coming together, and one name kept surfacing: Marcus Lane, a powerful businessman with deep connections in the city's political scene. Lane was a close friend of Charles Whitaker, and his company had recently made substantial donations to Whitaker's campaign. But there was something strange. Many of the funds came from shell corporations with no clear source. Emily looked over the evidence they'd gathered, her pulse racing. This looks like more than just financial support. It's almost as if Lane is trying to control the outcome of the election itself. Jack nodded. "We've seen this kind of thing before, but Vanguard's influence goes deeper. They don't just donate money, they make sure people stay loyal. They've got a grip on everyone from police chiefs to city officials." Rick seemed uneasy, glancing at the papers spread across the table. "Whitaker is ambitious, but I don't think he'd risk working directly with a group like Vanguard. If they're involved, maybe he doesn't even know." Emily wasn't so sure. The deeper they dug, the more evidence pointed to someone on Whitaker's team, or Whitaker himself, working closely with Vanguard to ensure his victory. And if Vanguard truly was pulling the strings, they wouldn't hesitate to get rid of anyone who posed a threat to their plans. As they ended their meeting that night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. It was a risk, this alliance they'd formed, a journalist, a detective, and a political consultant, each with their own motivations. But if they wanted to take on Vanguard, they'd have to trust each other. Little did they know, their investigation had already attracted attention from dangerous eyes. Emily's office was cluttered with stacks of notes, news clippings, and blurry photos, each piece a fragment of the web she and Jack were trying to untangle. The more they dug, the clearer it became. The election wasn't just a matter of votes. It was a battlefield of power and influence involving some of the city's most untouchable figures. Late one evening, Jack called her over to a quiet diner, his voice tense. When she arrived, he slid a folder across the table. "I got this from a source in City Hall," he said, his voice low. "It's a list of voters who've already been counted, days before the actual vote, and look, same addresses, different names, dead people's names." Emily flipped through the pages, each line making her stomach twist. "This is insane. This means votes are being manufactured. It's fraud on a massive scale." Jack nodded. "It's bigger than just one election. These numbers show up every time someone like Whitaker runs for office. This isn't just about him. It's a system." Emily could hardly believe it. This wasn't just election manipulation. It was a carefully crafted illusion of democracy, a lie built by people who had power and wanted to keep it. The next day, Emily met with Rick at their usual coffee shop, her thoughts racing. She was excited to tell him what she and Jack had uncovered, hoping he might help connect the dots from within the campaign. But as she explained, she noticed Rick's expression shift from concern to something colder. He interrupted her, his tone unusually sharp. "Emily, maybe it's time to let this go. People aren't ready for this kind of story. It could ruin lives, end careers, maybe even yours." Emily frowned, confused by his reaction. "Rick, this isn't just a story. People deserve to know what's happening." Rick leaned back, avoiding her eyes. "Sometimes, things are just the way they are, Em. Not everything can or should be changed." His words stung. The Rick she knew had always believed in doing the right thing, but now he seemed more invested in protecting his new political connections than in exposing the truth. As she left, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That evening, Emily met with Jack, her mind still troubled by Rick's reaction. She told him what had happened, and Jack's face hardened. "Emily, I didn't want to bring this up, but I ran a background check on Rick," he said. "Turns out he's been working with Marcus Lane's firm as a consultant for months. He might be feeding information back to them, using you to find out what we know." Emily's heart sank. "But he's my friend. I've known him for years." Jack gave her a sympathetic look. "I know it's hard, but in this line of work, trust can be dangerous. Rick might still care about you, but if he's involved, he's part of the system we're fighting against." Emily felt a wave of betrayal, torn between loyalty to an old friend and the harsh truth that he might be on the wrong side. If Rick really was involved, he'd have every reason to try to discourage her from digging further, to keep her from uncovering the extent of the election fraud. As she wrestled with her decision, she knew the stakes were higher than ever. She was faced with a painful choice. Continue trusting Rick, hoping he would eventually do the right thing, or break ties with him and press forward, trusting Jack and the evidence they'd gathered together. The truth was becoming clearer, but so were the risks. Emily sat alone in her small office at the Capitol Chronicle, feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down on her. Days had passed since her last conversation with Rick, and her growing doubts had only intensified. She felt trapped, caught between her loyalty to an old friend and the mountain of evidence that pointed to something dark. Just then, her phone buzzed with a message from Jack. Suspended. Need to talk. Meet me at the river dock. Midnight. Emily's heart sank. Jack had been a lifeline, her only ally in exposing the truth. Now he was facing the consequences of digging too deep. That night, she slipped out of her apartment and headed for the docks where Jack was waiting, his face shadowed by the dim light. "They suspended me this morning," Jack said, his voice tense. "They're saying I interfered in official investigations, but I know it's because we're getting too close. They want me out of the way." Emily clenched her fists. "This just proves that we're onto something huge, but if we keep going, we'll have to do it alone." Jack nodded. "I'm in if you are, but I have to warn you, it's going to get messy." He hesitated before adding, "There's something else. I dug deeper into Rick's background. He's been working for Vanguard directly. He's not just involved. He's one of their top strategists." Emily felt her stomach turn. She remembered all the conversations, the late nights discussing her theories, how she trusted him with every piece of information she found, and all along he had been using her to keep the truth buried. She felt the sharp sting of betrayal, but it also fueled her resolve. "He's been manipulating me, distracting me from the real story," she muttered, "but not anymore." Over the next week, Emily and Jack worked in secret, gathering every shred of evidence they could find. Jack continued to use his contacts to get files, while Emily relied on her instincts and knowledge of the city's political landscape. One night, as they reviewed their findings, Jack pulled out a new file. "Emily, it's not just Whitaker's team. The other candidate, Evans, has also been getting dirty money, shell companies, untraceable donors, and backdoor deals. Both campaigns are wrapped up in this. Vanguard's not backing just one side. They're controlling both. It's all just a show." Emily stared at him, shocked. "So, no matter who wins, Vanguard has the power. They're creating an illusion of choice to make people think they have a voice. But it's all fake." Jack nodded grimly. "They're using the election as a tool to keep people pacified, feeding the public lies while they hold all the strings." Emily's mind raced. She had started out thinking she was uncovering a scandal about one candidate, but now she realized the entire system was a puppet show orchestrated by an organization that wanted complete control. It was a scheme that went deeper than she'd ever imagined. The night before the election, Emily couldn't shake a sense of dread. She knew the risk of releasing the story. If Vanguard had infiltrated the police and government, they could easily silence her. But she also knew she couldn't back down now. She owed it to herself and to the city to expose the truth. She spent hours drafting her article, laying out every piece of evidence she and Jack had gathered. She painted a clear picture of Vanguard's manipulation, of how both candidates were entangled in the web of corruption, and how the people's choice had been stolen from them. As she typed the final words, a realization dawned on her. This might be her last article. Emily stared at her screen, reading and rereading the words she'd written. She had poured everything into this article, the documents, testimonies, anonymous sources, and photos. It was all here. The connections between Vanguard, the two leading candidates, the manipulated votes, and the sprawling web of corruption they controlled. She glanced over at Jack, who sat across from her, his face grim but determined. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "Once this goes live, there's no going back." Emily nodded, a slight tremor in her voice. "People deserve to know the truth, Jack. Even if it's dangerous, they need to see the system for what it really is. With a final deep breath, Emily hit publish. The article went live within seconds, appearing across social media feeds, news aggregators, and email lists. She knew it wouldn't take long for the story to catch fire and for Vanguard to realize they'd been exposed. The response was explosive. Within hours, the city was buzzing with shock, anger, and disbelief. Commentators on television and online were frantically dissecting the article, piecing together the layers of deceit and control that Emily had uncovered. Citizens flooded social media with outrage, demanding explanations and resignations. Protests sprang up across the city, people gathering to voice their fury at having been manipulated for so long. In the days that followed, both candidates scrambled to distance themselves from the accusations. Whitaker and Evans held desperate press conferences, claiming ignorance and promising thorough investigations, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. Emily's evidence was undeniable. The city had seen enough to know that both campaigns were rotten to the core. Jack watched the news beside her in silence. "We did it," he said softly, almost disbelieving. "The people know." But there was no time to celebrate. Emily had received several anonymous threats since the article's release, reminding her that Vanguard wouldn't disappear quietly. She knew her life would never be the same, that this decision had placed her squarely in their crosshairs. But she didn't regret it. One evening, as the protests swelled and calls for reform echoed through the streets, Emily and Jack met on a quiet bench overlooking the city's skyline. Jack looked at her, admiration mixed with worry in his eyes. "You know, they're not just going to let this go. Vanguard will regroup. They'll find new ways to hold on to power." Emily nodded, her gaze resolute. "Maybe they will, but at least now people know the truth. They won't be so easily fooled again. We've given them a reason to question, to demand change." Jack smiled faintly. "So, what's next?" Emily took a deep breath, her heart steady despite the uncertainty. "We keep going, Jack. We dig deeper, expose more, and make sure Vanguard and everyone like them know they're not invincible. This was just the beginning." As they sat side by side, watching the lights of the city, a quiet determination settled between them. They were both aware of the dangers that lay ahead, of the battles they would face, but they also knew that together they had the strength to face them head on. The election might not change overnight, but a spark had been lit in the city, a spark of awareness, of resistance, and as long as they were there to fan the flames, Emily knew there was hope for something better.